So we are so we're going through what we call the biomolecules, these organic compounds that make up living things. So we've covered one, carbohydrates, and a couple more that we'll talk about. And so the next one that we'll discuss are lipids. And lipids is a pretty large class of molecules overall in terms of all of biochemistry or all of chemistry in general. We're going to talk about specific types of lipids that are important for our function. So lipids are things like fats, oils, waxes. Those are examples of lipids.
What is lard?
And lard is just a type of fat. And so generally we call things that are solids at room temperature fats, and liquids at room temperature oils. But obviously you can make a liquid into a solid. You can make oil into a solid in different ways. You can melt fats into oils. And fats and lipids are very important in living things for various reasons. First of all, layers of fat insulate our body and cushion our organs, protecting them. Fats are the component that makes up most of the cell membrane. If you remember back when we talked about the cells, the cell membrane is composed of what? Phospholipids, a phospholipid bilayer. So again, lipid in the name tells us that it's a fat.
You spelled bilayer wrong.
I did. Bilayer, that should say. So phospholipid bilayer is composed of lipids with a phosphate head. Cholesterol is a lipid. It's found in the cell membrane. Many vitamins are fat soluble only. And if your diet were completely deficient in fat, you would have a deficiency of those vitamins. Also, fats are a source of energy. So as you know from probably health class and 7th grade science, that fats store 9 calories per gram, more than double what carbohydrates store. So they're a high density source of energy. And so in our body, when we have excess energy, when we consume more calories than we use, excess calories are stored in lipids, in fats in our body, for later usage when we have a deficit of calories. So fat is a source of energy. Fats take longer to digest than carbohydrates. They're not as, they're a little bit more difficult to break down in the body. Many types of living things, plants use lipids, mainly oils, to store energy. Okay. The oils are found in seeds generally, and they can be extracted from those seeds as well. We talked about germination and carbohydrates and starch being stored in seeds to provide the initial energy for a plant to begin growing. Well, some of that energy is also stored in oils. So as in carbohydrates, fats, lipids that we're going to talk about, they're also composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, those 3 elements. However, they don't have that same typical 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen that carbohydrates do. So one way, if you're looking at a molecular formula or a structural formula of a compound and you're trying to decide, is this a lipid or is this a carbohydrate, one easy way to tell is by looking at that ratio. So for example, castor oil. Castor oil is type of oil, comes from a castor bean. Used to be used, or you watch old movies sometimes, it used to be used as a punishment for kids, like if they're being bad, their parents would give them a tablespoonful of castor oil because it tastes so horrible. But anyway, castor oil is C18H34O3. So it doesn't have that typical 2-to-1 ratio that carbohydrates do. So let's talk a little bit about the chemistry of lipids. The lipids we're going to be talking about are made up of two different sort of building blocks. Okay? A glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. So organic acids have a group attached to them. So these are fatty acids. Here's a fatty acid as well. Okay? And these fatty acids have a carboxyl group attached to them. And carboxyl group is something you should recognize. Okay? And it's often abbreviated COOH. Structurally, it's a carbon that's double bonded to an oxygen, and then with a hydroxide attached to that. So it's CO and then the OH for the hydroxyl group. And so that makes an organic acid. And so here we have some of these fatty acids. They can be of varying lengths as well. Okay, so these are relatively short fatty acids because they need to fit on the slide, but they can go on for a very long chain there. Okay? You can see in some of these fatty acids, it can be 18 carbons or 16 or 4 and so forth. So these are relatively short. Okay? And so what we have, this is the glycerol molecule. Okay, it's a 3-carbon. It's a 3-carbon molecule. Okay, that has hydrogen and then hydroxide groups attached to it. And so when a glycerol combines with fatty acid, you can see in this diagram sort of how they are going to bond together. We have from the hydroxide groups, okay, the hydroxide group from the carboxyl group here bonds with the hydrogen from this hydroxide group in the glycerol. And what do we lose from this? Water. Okay, and we bond together these remaining atoms. And so when we're forming one lipid from 3 fatty acids and a glycerol, okay, how many water molecules are released? 3. 1 here, and 1 here. Okay. So glycerol plus 3 fatty acids form a lipid. There are, we have these names. You've heard of saturated, unsaturated fats, right? Yeah. Saturated and unsaturated fats, what those terms mean. So which is healthier for you? Unsaturated fats, correct. And saturated fats, here's an example of a saturated, what is this? What am I showing you?
Fatty acid.
That's a fatty acid, right? We have the carboxyl group over here. We have our chain of carbon and hydrogen. Same thing here. So this is a saturated fat. That's an unsaturated fat. Okay. What's the difference between them? Nate?
In the unsaturated fat, like about halfway through, there's a double bond.
There's a double bond. And that's what makes an unsaturated fat, is that there's a double bond there. Okay? This is a mono unsaturated fat. This is a poly unsaturated fat. What's the difference between those two? Mono meaning one, that there's just one double bond there. Poly meaning there are several double bonds. Okay. So why do you think this is called a saturated fat and this is unsaturated? You know, we've heard those terms before, right? What is like a saturated solution mean? It's full. It's holding as much of a solute as possible. So what do you think? What is a saturated fat saturated with?
Hydrogen.
Saturated with hydrogen. It's holding as much hydrogen as it possibly can because we have all single bonds. An unsaturated fat, such as this one, if this double bond were broken, what could it be replaced with? A hydrogen here and a single bond with this carbon. Then this would be a saturated fat. But it's not. It has some room for some more hydrogen. In fact, unsaturated fats can be made into saturated fats by a process called hydrogenation. Okay? You may have seen in the ingredients, hydrogenated oils are when hydrogen, through chemical process, is added to saturate those unsaturated fats and make them into solids. Because saturated fats form solids usually at room temperature, whereas unsaturated fats generally are liquids at room temperature. So, when we look at the differences, saturated fats are often animal-based, come from animal products. Okay, the fat in meats and dairy products, those are saturated fats. Unsaturated fats generally come from plants, okay, fish. Saturated fats are more difficult to digest. Unsaturated fats are easier to digest. The bonds in a saturated fat are all single bonds. Bonds in an unsaturated fat contains double bonds. In terms of health, okay, saturated fats are generally unhealthy. They can form plaques in our blood vessels, contributing to atherosclerosis, other cardiovascular disease. Unsaturated fats are healthier. Okay? There's the mono unsaturated fats, things like olive oil, the healthier ones, peanut oil, and polyunsaturated things like corn oil, canola oil, and so forth. The state of matter at room temperature, generally saturated fats are solids, unsaturated fats are liquids. Can you have any idea why do saturated fats form solids at room temperature? Anyone come up with an idea about why? Sophia?
Single bond more powerful than multiple.
It's not so much they're more powerful. It does have to do with the bonding. It has to do also with the shapes. Okay? Because single bonded saturated fats, all of those fatty acids sort of line up in a straight line and sort of fit together and are closer together and therefore can bond between molecules more easily, so they form a solid. Whereas with unsaturated fats, because the shape of those fatty acids, they sort of bend, they can be at odd angles, they don't sort of stack up as easily, and therefore don't have those bonds between molecules forming a solid, they stay in the liquid state. Are there any questions about those?
Just curiosity, can I use the bathroom?
Yep.